I work with teacher training at Melbourne Graduate School of Education. So we work with primary and secondary teachers, and we do a lot of work with practicing teachers as well, which is, I understand, very similar to the work that you do here. So there's been a lot of changes recently in second language acquisition theory, and even in first language acquisition theory as well. A lot of this work comes out of the United Kingdom, the United States, and Northern Europe. And it focuses around the notion of translanguaging. And I'll unpack that a little bit more in a minute, but drawing on all of the linguistic resources of students in the service of learning. But in Australia, our context is quite different. And so this work is very exciting, but we need to do a lot of work to understand how it can actually work in our local context. Because the arguments that are coming out really reflect the different locations that people are working in. So I'm going to talk a little about the changes in the theory and in how we've been trying to research it and understand it within our own local context. But first, a little bit about Australia. So English is our national language, our education is in English, and all our services are in English. Every 5 years, the government organises a census, which is filled in by all Australians, and it asks us questions about language, education, all sorts of questions, and it informs government policy and the development of government services. So one of the questions on the survey is, do you speak a language other than English, predominantly at home? So in the last census, 22% of people said that they speak predominantly a language other than English at home. So that doesn't include people such as myself who speaks a second language, but my husband doesn't, so we speak English at home. So our level of bilingualism or multilingualism, I'm going to use the term bilingualism, but I'm also referring to multilinguals tonight, is probably around 25% of people. So monolingual English country, but we have a lot of language diversity at an individual level. 34% of people have both parents born outside of Australia. So we're a very young country, like the United States, Canada, New Zealand. We are migrant countries, and we depend on migrants for whether some people in the public like it or not, but we are dependent upon them for population growth in Australia. And it's brought an incredible diversity to our country. There are over 350 languages that are spoken, and since big migration drives began in the 1940s, the government have organised translating services. So there's a national translation service. If you go to a doctor or any government service and you need assistance with language, there is a national translation service in over 250 languages. So the government is very supportive of the multilingualism in Australia. Of course, our populations congregate in the two major cities of Sydney and Melbourne, where I live. And in here, it's more diverse. Over 38% of people speak languages other than English, and nearly 50% of people have both parents born overseas. That includes in English-speaking countries as well as non-English-speaking countries. So this presents real challenges for the teachers in our major cities, because approximately 1 in 4 students enter the school system without English or are learning English through the system. And so they need to learn a lot of skills to deal with the complexity in the classroom. We also have, besides immigration, we have Indigenous Australians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. When the British Empire first had contact with Australia, we had over 250 Indigenous languages, up to 700 depending on how you count dialects and languages. Now, unfortunately, we only have about 12 viable languages, which means that they'll be passed down to the next generation. We have about 120 that are still used, but most of them won't be learned as a first language in another generation, which is very unfortunate, but there's a lot of work being done in this area. But a lot of our students in this area, Northern Australia, Western Australia, live in remote communities, and for them English is a foreign language, essentially. They speak their languages in their community, they only hear English when they enter the school, they leave the school, they don't hear English again. So again, this is another category of student. They do not do well in the education system because it fails to understand that. And it measures them against measures for children who learn English as a first language. And then a lot of Indigenous Australians speak Aboriginal English, which is a dialect of English. So when they enter the school system, they need to learn standard Australian English, and as well as Aboriginal English. So Our teachers need to consider the development of people's first language, their English if they're learning English as an additional language or dialect, English as a foreign language students. Most of our students learn a language other than English, French, German, Chinese, and we have some really highly skilled multilingual students as well. So teachers have a lot to consider in their classroom. So we need to understand, so this is the question, what role is there for plurilingual pedagogies? How do we understand all that children do and have in their lives and draw on that rather than focusing on what they don't have and what they can't do? So if we go to back to second language acquisition theories, so a lot of the role of the first language in the second language classroom has always been a bit contentious. A lot of the principles of second language learning, particularly learning English as a second language, come from Western academics, largely monolingual, predominantly male, who bring a very specific perspective to language learning. And they view it as a zero-sum game. If you are learning English, you should only have English. Any other language is interference and is a negative thing. It's a zero-sum game. But what this fails to understand is the potential value of contrastive analysis and comparative metalinguistic knowledge as a learning resource. So this view holds that students have a limited capacity to learn language and that we have to hold back one to learn another. So this view of languages often views language as discrete systems. So think of it as two buckets. One language is in one bucket, another language in another bucket, and there's no interaction between them. This is Cummins in 2008 started challenging the notion of the two solitudes, or the 3 or 4 or 5 solitudes, depending on how many languages you speak. And he argued that students' linguistic resources there's actually a common underlying proficiency. There is one bucket that we draw from, and we use whatever we need in every context. It's different, every interaction is different, and we draw on something different every time from our whole linguistic repertoire. So our language use is more like this, a complex and dynamic linguistic system, rather than these separate discrete things which we switch between. Now, this is somewhat problematic in the education system for us because our curriculum, our pedagogy and our assessment are based on the notion that languages are these buckets that you switch between. Perform in this language, and hold back the other languages. The view is that bilinguals are two monolinguals stuck together. But as soon as you start learning another language, you're doing really complex things. You're comparing, contrasting, deciding what phrase to use, transferring consciously or unconsciously from one language to another till you come up with what you need. Sometimes it comes out mixed up, sometimes it comes out sounding not normal, but beautiful anyway. So having a better understanding of what bilinguals do has really led to a big paradigm shift in second language acquisition theory. We've had a huge, you could spend your whole salary every year on the number of books that are coming out at the moment on this topic. Lots of different terms over recent years: flexible bilingualism, heteroglossia, polylanguaging, metrolingualism, translanguaging, code mesh and code mixing. Doesn't matter what term it is. What they're all trying to understand is new ways of understanding how languages are used, what this means for language acquisition and for our education system. So translanguaging is probably the thing that is most dominant in research at the moment. And translanguaging is two things. It's what bilinguals do, have always done, there's nothing new there. But it's also a teacher's pedagogy. And that's what changes, what we allow and disallow in the education system. So the argument is that translanguaging should involve students and teacher pedagogy. Kanagaraja argues that translanguaging is social practices of mixing modes and symbol systems as a creative improvisation to adapt to the needs of the context and the local situation. Every interaction, what we draw on is different, and we draw on all that we have, if we're allowed. Li Wei also writes a lot in this area and argues that a translanguaging space allows multilinguals to integrate social spaces, personal history, experience, environment, attitude, belief, ideology in one meaningful, performance that includes creativity and criticality. So all of these authors, academics, as well as many more, see this as a social justice issue. That multilingual students are not allowed, as their monolingual peers are, to access and use all of their linguistic resources. And so for more equitable educational opportunities, we should be allowing our students more freedom in their language choices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a range of research we've been doing in Australia. So my colleague Jacqueline Duarte works in Sydney, Western Sydney University, which is a low socioeconomic area of Sydney. Population and demographics in Sydney tend to be what we say slightly ghettoised. Language groups tend to congregate, newer groups stay together, our lower socioeconomic groups stay together. Obviously there are costs of housing issues. So Sydney has what they call high needs schools. Schools with low socioeconomic students with poor literacy, students with language background other than English, Indigenous speakers of Aboriginal English, and these schools they call high needs. They have a very negative status. Teachers can feel very negative about working in these schools. They don't always have a choice where they go. And so the government was very concerned in trying to do work to improve the standing of these schools and teachers' beliefs in the students and students' beliefs in themselves. So Jackie's been doing work projects that last from 6 months to a year. And she starts off with language mapping, so helping the students understand and become aware of all the language practices outside of school as well as inside school. How do you use language differently when you go to church, when you play sport, when you talk to an adult, to a child? This is for monolingual speakers as well as multilingual speakers. Registers, modes, all sorts of things. And after a period of time, they move on to drawing their language maps, which are about language and identity for these students. They do a lot of work with students on using this to understand. They map, they graph, they do all sorts of things as a class and present representations of all that they can do. The teachers take this information and develop a curriculum based on what the students know, what their lives are about, and together the teachers and students move forward the curriculum. And they found it's had a really positive impact in the schools. They were originally done in English literacy classes, and now they're taking whole school approaches to this and moving them into all the curriculum areas. It's hard to measure whether it has an impact on literacy outcomes, because these are big questions you're asking. Sometimes we say if you can answer the question, it's not big enough. So we're still trying to answer the question, but overall it's had a really positive impact. So we've taken this work to Victoria, where I live, and moved them into the EAL-only context. When migrant children come to Australia and refugee children, they're given time in a government school which teaches English only. Then they move into a mainstream school. So if you're an immigrant and you've had schooling, you get 6 months. If you are a refugee, you've probably had interrupted schooling, you've moved from camp to camp and may not have an experience of schooling, they get 12 months. So we moved in, we wanted to understand language practices in these spaces. The teachers are very supportive. The schools have a rule of English only in the classroom. So we were interested to see what actually happened in the classroom as opposed to what policy is, because ultimately teachers are the policy makers. So the questions we wanted to ask were, what are the teachers' beliefs in relation to the use of L1? What does this look like pedagogically in the classroom? What can language mapping tell teachers about their students and their linguistic repertoires? And how might language mapping inform practices? Just due to time, I'm just going to focus on these 2 questions, and I'm going to present 4 maps from 2 classes and just talk through the maps, and then talk about what the teachers thought and one thing they changed in their practice as a result. So the first set of maps are from students who are 8 or 9 years old, and they've been in Australia between 10 weeks and 3 months. So they're new arrivals. And I'll show you 4 maps, but I'll just break down this one. So they're asked to write about all the languages they use and all that they do with languages. Of course, children write and draw about what matters to them most. So as you can see, you have a big space here, which is where he was probably going to write English. This child spoke to me in English, but he was not emotionally ready to identify as an English speaker. His life we translated all the maps. He's written in Chinese. They're allowed to write in whatever language they wanted. Is his house. So his family is mainly back home. His father is not there, so he's lost that structure that he had. He thinks it's freedom. He plays computer games all the time and watches TV all the time, but it has a really significant impact on his ability to engage at school. His mother works very, very long hours to support his transition into the Australian education system. Next student, similar thing. Chinese, Cantonese, happy to talk about all the things they did, not willing to put down that they were users of English, even though she was speaking to me in English. Again, all the things with Chinese, with the mother, with the sister, with the father through WeChat, a lot of the families back home, as I said, and a little bit of English with her father. And another example, again, the father is back in Beijing, child is watching TV, their life is in their house, and they leave the English side blank, regardless of the encouragement. So when the teacher looked through these maps, the theme that she decided that she felt was coming from the maps and from the conversations with the teachers, with the students, was that transitioning into school is silencing. It shuts down all languages in a student. They're not supposed to use their other languages, but they don't have English, or they don't feel they have much in English, and they just go quiet. They don't want to say anything, they don't want to engage with school. It's very upsetting for most of the students. And so she thought long and hard about the importance of drawing on their prior knowledge and of bringing more of their languages and their experiences with them to draw their voices out again. So one thing that she did, I'll just give one example. She always has a very strong focus. You must write down the full sentence. You must write down the full structure, regardless of what level you're at. That was always her focus. The children had to write reports on marsupials, which are strange animals with pouches, like kangaroos or koalas, echidnas, things like that. So rather than just say this is a koala or this is an echidna, she had them all Google Translate or write down the word in their language. And then they wrote it down in English, so that they picture the word in their first language, and they all had different languages, and English. And she said the impact of just letting them write down their word in their language was really amazing. They were so proud to be able to do it. Then she got them to write a phrase in their language, and they worked on it in English. And then they expanded it to a sentence in their first language. Whether it was correct or not, she had no idea because she didn't speak their languages, and then in English. And she said it had incredible impact. They really got excited, and they wanted to share on the English side of things because they were able to express it, and there was some validation of their first languages. So even though this was a small change, she was applied in different contexts, giving them a lot more opportunities to talk in first language, if it was possible, and to use their first language, regardless of whether she understood it or not. And she felt that was helping students open up a bit more. Just a small change. This set of maps, as you can see, is quite different. These are secondary school students, and they're going to enter into upper secondary school in the mainstream. So they have quite a lot of demands on them in terms of improving their linguistic capacity. But as you can see, they're quite expressive, and they have very extensive social media use. So these are the Chinese versions of eBay and YouTube and music apps, WeChat and QQ, social media apps. They spend a lot of their life on these. They come to Australia and live with guardians, so they don't have parental structures, and they just spend all their time on social media. So I'll show you some of the maps. As you can see, they're quite expressive. We give them images to help with the process, and some of them integrate the images into their maps. They like writing, and they're quite happy to talk about their dialects, their home languages, the difference between that and the main language. So they're really keen on writing. And so when the teacher looked at the maps, she was very supportive of them using their language in the classroom. So they could write bilingual vocab lists, they could use Google Translate if they needed to, they could talk to each other in their first language. These students were really, really keen to learn English, writing and reading. They would ask for extra homework to write essays. They were just really amazing students, but there was no role for English or interpersonal communication in their lives. everything was done in Chinese, outside of the classroom. All their social media use, they lived in an area where there's lots of Chinese shops and Chinese speakers, so they used Chinese for everything. There was no role for English for communication. And she felt this was really problematic, particularly given that they were going into a mainstream school the next year. And so she chose to ban the use of spoken first languages in the classroom. Students could still write and use bilingual dictionaries and things like that. But she felt, sorry, I'm not sure if I got it there, that it was a context-dependent decision. That once she understood the whole life world of students and their whole language world, she had a better understanding of really what they needed. And so for a period of time, for the rest of the semester, there was English only spoken in the classroom. And she felt that that was beneficial to them. She didn't have enough time to explain why she made that decision, but on reflection, she said next lot of students, she will spend more time explaining you need to understand what you do, when, where and how, and where your strengths and weaknesses are, and how I can help you do that. Okay, so that was just a couple of the classrooms. My colleagues are doing a number of projects, similar work. My colleague Julie Choi does this work using language profiles. So language learning or use of language by bilinguals is emotional, it's cognitive, it's all sorts of things. So she helps them, they draw images of their languages, what it feels like to them, how they express themselves, and she does a lot of really interesting work this way with her students, student teachers, before they go into school, and they do this in the school. Some of them are very funny, very interesting. This one, for example, was monolingual speaker of English. And these are the languages of her students and her friends, and her heart is open. I don't know any other languages, but my heart is open, and I want to be part of other people's experiences. So they come up with some really, very interesting things. This is a bit hard to see, but these are actually Venn diagrams. So we have a number of bilingual schools, primary schools in Victoria, and my colleague Marianne Turner is doing her research at a Japanese-English bilingual school. Very separate treatment of the languages. Japanese literacy, English literacy. This science in Japanese, maths in English. Languages are treated very separately, and she wanted to see if she could help them mix it up a bit. So the students actually speak a lot of other languages than Japanese or English. They tended to come in speaking Japanese and other languages, but not English, or English and other languages, but not Japanese. So it's quite overwhelming for them to go in and have to suddenly be educated in another language. She got the parents of the students to come in and read in their home language. And so for Russian, in Filipino, in Punjabi, each day of the week they would come in and read in another language. And the students loved it. They then did comparative work using Venn diagrams on similarities and differences between the languages. So this one is analysis of English and Russian. Obviously in a Venn diagram you have a middle component which is similar, and then what is distinctly different. And this one is Korean, English and Japanese. So what's common and what's distinct. These are largely linguistic analysis of grammar and things like that, whatever the children knows. So it's been really successful, and they're still going on with the bilingual reading, which is great. So just some examples of the kind of work that's being done. So just in summary, not that it's really a finding, but really what we're trying to argue in the work that we do is that we need to lose the binary. Languages, practices aren't monolingual or multilingual. They are mediated, negotiated, and practiced in complex ways. Being bilingual is complex. It carries meaning related to personal experiences, both positive and negative. It makes you feel part of more than one world, and sometimes it's difficult to feel comfortable and accepted in either world. 4 points on this slide. So we argue that there is a need to recognise and value students' linguistic repertoires and to understand how we can draw on them in the service of learning. And this is despite the education system, which forces us to take a monoglossic, monolingual view. And allowing access to other languages can really help students reach higher order thinking processes rather than the lower order of rote learning, remembering, recalling. And drawing on the comparison of languages allows students to access their metalinguistic knowledge as well. So we also need to challenge curriculum and assessment structures that continue to imagine languages as objects of study and not genuine forms of communication. We have schools that, one very low socioeconomic high school that nobody wanted to go to. The teacher came in and said, I'm going to teach one subject in Italian using a CLIL program, Content and Language Integrated Program. And from there, he's built 2 full streams of bilingual students, from year 7 to year 10. We're not allowed to have bilingual education at year 11 and 12. The assessment and curriculum structure is set by a different authority. They do it from year 7 to year 10. There's a waiting list at the school. People can't wait to get in. And the students in those streams, they've had enough students go through now to show that they outperform other students on maths, English, and far outperform students in the standard Italian stream, which is understandable given the exposure they get. But because students study maths in Italian, they have to concentrate, they have to focus, they have to draw on everything they have, they learn and they perform better than others. So we're really hoping that small steps we can take, and it's probably not possible to change the entire curriculum and education system, but as teachers, as I said, we are the policy makers in the classroom. There's a lot we can do within the structures that are there in the service of our students. So, thank you.
Thank you.